So I'm joined today by Dr. Barnabas Asprey, and Barney is a colleague of mine. We did our PhDs together at the University of Cambridge. There, Barney was working on 20th century French philosophy with a particular focus on the writings and works of Paul Ricoeur, focusing through that on the philosophy of religion. He's since moved on to do postdoctoral research at Oxford, where he's doing a project on Christian responses to refugees. Barney is a Christian theologian. And Barney, before we start talking about the Sermon on the Mount, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what does it mean then to be a Christian theologian? What are some of the methods that you use when doing your research, or what are the ways that you approach your scholarship?
Oh, that's a great question. I guess my first definition of a Christian theologian is basically somebody who tries to understand reality through the lens of the Christian tradition. So the topics that you can have in theology can be pretty much anything you like. Ethical topics or questions about obviously God or human society or the ideal society or whatever. But those topics are always approached using the Christian tradition, the Bible, and also the writings of Christians since the Bible as the primary resource to guide your thinking.
And so in the course that I'm teaching, we're focused on contemplation. The course Introduction to Contemplative Well-Being is the title. But yeah, we focus a lot on contemplation, and there are definitely religious roots and religious ways of being contemplative. I wonder if you're familiar of any of them within the Christian tradition, or is that something like when you approach Christian theology, what are kind of the questions that you're asking? What are the things that you're trying to learn about? What are the answers you're trying to articulate?
There's a rich tradition of contemplation within Christianity for sure, and it goes back a long way. I think since the sort of official beginning of Christianity, one of the first rich traditions of contemplation is by a group of people who are now called the Desert Fathers. Mm-hmm. And these people, in about the 4th century and a couple of centuries after that, they decided to leave society and go into the desert to practice contemplation in an ascetic way. So they were very intense at fasting and at prayer and at isolation. And they inaugurated many sort of insights and practices that later on developed into the monastic movement, where you have monks and nuns, which people are much more familiar with in the West. But they have their roots originally in the Desert Fathers.
Okay. And for you as a theologian, what are some of the questions that you're asking now? What are you trying to answer, let's say in your current research project or in the one that you did during your PhD? What are the types of questions you're after?
So in my PhD, I was looking at the question of what it means to talk about God in philosophy and how you distinguish between the God who philosophers can talk about and the God who Christian theologians can talk about. And is there a distinction? And if there is it useful to talk about the God of the philosophers if you're a theologian? Those kinds of questions. In my current research, I'm thinking much more practically about how Christians ought to think in light of the Christian tradition about the contemporary situation of refugees, immigrants, and asylum seekers, which is a very political question, obviously. And there's a lot of different types of Christian opinion on that. If you're in North America, then you know all about that, probably. But I'm exploring probably what the resources over the centuries, like the refugees are not a new phenomenon. There have always been refugees ever since there's been human society. And so Christians have thought about it long before the 21st century, what we call the refugee crisis, even though it isn't actually a crisis and that kind of thing.
And so when we're looking, I think that's actually a great transition. You mentioned that the question you're asking now in your refugee project is a little more political. What's interesting to me is knowing how the Beatitudes, the first part of the Sermon on the Mount, that that section of Christ's words are sometimes used very politically, right? So I'm actually thinking, just a couple of weeks ago, I saw in an Instagram story of someone writing, "Blessed are the abortion providers," right? Which is certainly a reference to this Beatitudes, to the Beatitudes, right? But making also very political statements to things that are happening in Texas at the moment, where,
Yeah.
like, so it's a very politically charged sermon, right? And so I wonder if we could turn to the sermon itself, starting with the Beatitudes, I think. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So we have these words of Christ. What do we make of them? What are we supposed to take from these blessings?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Jesus didn't invent the phrase "blessed are." You know, the whole idea of listing a group of people who are blessed was not unique to Jesus. He's using a form or a genre of teaching that was common in the time. Many of the Jewish rabbis would have done the same. They would have given a very long sort of set of instructions to their disciples, and they would have started that set of instructions by listing who they consider to be the in crowd. Who are my people? Who are the people I think like are the blessed ones, the ones who belong to me, the ones who I'm on the side of, and the ones who are on my side. So the form of what Jesus is doing in the Beatitudes, he didn't invent that.
Okay.
But the content, as in the kinds of people Jesus says are blessed, that is pretty new and unique, and in many ways rather bizarre for the context.
Can you say more? Why is it bizarre?
Well, it's not intuitive to say blessed are those who mourn. And it's not intuitive to say blessed are the poor in spirit, or those who hunger and thirst. Or in some ways, it's a list of the people who are the down and outs, the ones who haven't had a good life. You know, it's almost as though Jesus is turning everything topsy-turvy.
At least at the beginning, right? So I just got it here in front of me. It seems like maybe we have a shift that happens on verse 7, maybe. Blessed are the merciful. Verse 8, blessed are the pure in heart. 9, blessed are the peacemakers. Those feel like good attributes, right?
Yeah.
And reading that contextually, maybe without knowledge of the time it was written.
Yeah. No, that's fair enough. That's absolutely true. But I do remember reading one theologian who said it's almost as though Jesus is saying, lucky are the unlucky. For those first four anyway. Like, if you've had something bad happening to you, if you're mourning it, or if you've faced injustice, then you're blessed, you're lucky. Well, how? Well, it always ends with something that is going to happen, right? So it's always saying, okay, if you've suffered injustice or some kind of calamity in your life, or if you're just poor in spirit, if you just know that there's a lot you need and you don't have it, then you're lucky, because guess what? The future is yours. You know, you're going to receive those things that you hunger for in the future. So there's a very interesting theological term called eschatology. That it means there's an eschatological dimension to these Beatitudes, which means they are focused on promises about what the future will bring to a certain type of people. And Jesus says, the good future, the promising future, the future that I'm guaranteeing good things for, is for people who have had a bad past, who've had a pretty rubbish time of it until now. Yeah, I mean, I've been not necessarily wanting to, but even sometimes against my will, I've been meditating on these Beatitudes since I was about 5 years old, when my dad read them to me. And at the time, I didn't, I was still learning language, and I thought that the Beatitudes were the attitudes that you were told to be. So to be these attitudes, I've now learned that.
Then what are
something different.
What are the Beatitudes then? You can let us all in. What are the Beatitudes? Why, like, they're not to be attitudes. What are these?
Beatific just means blessed. So the blessings. It's quite simple, really. It's all in the key is in how he begins each sentence. Blessed are. Mm-hmm. It's the list of blessings.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you've been you said meditating upon. You've been exposed to these at least since you were 5.
And at different times, different ones of them has stood out to me. Okay. I guess at the moment, the one that I find myself thinking about a little bit is just the very last one. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Mm-hmm. Because I think it's easy for us to forget sometimes that if you pursue a particular moral option wholeheartedly, then you will alienate yourselves from other people who don't pursue that moral option. You will find yourselves in conflict with those who disagree that is the right way to live, or who feel threatened by what would happen if your vision of the ideal society was actually realized. And we see that particularly in this whole issue of refugees, don't we? Like, there's a reason that there's a lot of opposition to refugees today. It's because people feel that their own power and their own security and their own cultural identity is being threatened. And so if you challenge people to say, actually, we want to be a more open society and a more welcoming society, that threatens people, and that means you face opposition.
But I wondered if we could move beyond the blessings and speak a little more about the Sermon on the Mount more broadly. So we have it. Well, why don't you tell us, Barney? What do we have with the Sermon on the Mount? What was happening here? Because we can read these and in ways that I often do, we can read them out of their context, and we can just read them as, okay, this is a beautiful blessing. I think they're filled with beautiful sentiment about how we could be in the world, how we might want our world to be. When I'm doing that, at least I'm not reading it in the context in which it was taught. I'm not reading it around with the surrounding context. I wonder if you could introduce us to that context.
Yeah, with pleasure. I think one of the first things we have to understand when reading any part of the New Testament is that it is a thoroughly Jewish text, and Jesus was a thoroughly Jewish person, and everything he did makes sense only in the context of his Jewish background and culture. And like I already said, this format of giving a long set of instructions to disciples and starting them with a list of the blessed is a common one for the time. But it's also, there's little clues in here that show Jesus to see himself as a very, very great figure within the Jewish tradition. The first clue is right at the beginning when it says Jesus went up on a mountainside. Now, if you're a Jewish reader reading this or listening to it spoken in the first century, and you heard that Jesus went up onto a mountain, it would immediately make you think of Moses, who went up on a mountain and received the law from God, which he then gave to the people of Israel. And so here we see Jesus setting himself up as a sort of new Moses, who is then giving a new law.
Can you tell us like a little more of who is he talking to? What was happening? Why this sermon? Why these topics?
Well, Jesus had become increasingly famous at the time as a sort of minor celebrity, going around preaching and teaching and healing people around the area of Galilee. And this is perhaps one of the sort of first more public occasions where there's large crowds gathering to hear him. He's gathered quite a large community of followers now, and so he wants to sit them down and explain to them what he's really all about in grand summary. And he probably said these things many times, the various things that you find in the Sermon on the Mount. He probably didn't just say them once here. And so
I'm really interested in that in terms of contemplation, because the definition that we're working with in our class for contemplation is the most literal dictionary definition, which is prolonged reflective thought upon a certain topic or theme or object. It does not have to be, therefore, an explicitly religious theme or topic or object. One does not have to contemplate God in order to contemplate. One does not have to use the teachings of a religious tradition in order to contemplate. But here we are having, I would say we are having examples of how one could live a contemplative life, especially because there's so much focus on the internal, the inner disposition, as you put it. I'm really interested in hearing from you as a Christian theologian, what people who are not Christians can do with these kinds of teachings. So, a lot of the way that you've been speaking of things so far, and the way that I know your work is, often writing for a Christian audience. What about those of us who are not in that category, when we're leaning into these teachings of the Christian figure, right, of Jesus? And in particular, I'm thinking, I know you're at least familiar a little bit with the writings of Swami Prabhavananda, where he also returns to this Sermon on the Mount. He focuses specifically, like we have done as well, on the Beatitudes, kind of reinterprets them through a Hindu theological lens. What are the options for those people to look to these words, to look to these writings? What might we be able to get from them, or is that even an option, if that makes sense?
Well, I think the New Testament is a public document as far as it goes. I mean, anybody's able to read it and draw any inspiration from it that they would like to. And from my perspective, I'm delighted whenever anybody gets insight or moral stimulation from reading the Sermon on the Mount. I think that's a wonderful thing. Yeah. I mean, it depends. If it's somebody who's more opposed to the Christian tradition, then I would wonder if they would find something in the Sermon on the Mount that they perhaps didn't agree with or didn't like. But if they're not signing up to be a Christian, then they're welcome to disagree with it as well.
I guess I'm wondering in particular, because the first part, the Beatitudes, other than the talk of seeing God or being called children of God, I don't see a lot of religious doctrinal language there, and maybe as we go through the Sermon on the Mount more, maybe certain doctrinal language or certain doctrinal points do come in a bit more. I mean, you would of course be better to speak to that than I would. But yeah, when I read a lot of the Beatitudes, and then again, kind of skimming through the broader Sermon on the Mount, right, where it speaks of this idea of eye for an eye, Jesus says to not only resist evil, but if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them, give them the left as well, right? Like, these are not necessarily statements about belief or doctrine, what someone should believe. It really strikes me as being a lot more about action, right? So again, I'm just scrolling through here, looking at subheadings of the Sermon on the eye for the eye, love for your enemies, giving to the needy. Perhaps when we arrive at prayer, being taught how to pray to the Father, perhaps that, feels a little more religiously embedded. But even that, I think, could be open for debate, whether one has to have those beliefs in order to pray in that way. Do not worry, judging others. What are these doctrinal belief statements? Does someone have to believe in Christian doctrine in order to kind of take some action points away from these teachings?
No, absolutely not. I mean, there's always many perspectives on any particular text, and on this text, if you read it from the perspective of I'm looking for guidance in how to live a morally upright life, there's a lot there to help you, for sure. I think when it comes to the Beatitudes, I mean, many things that Jesus says can be taken sort of isolated and made into a sort of inspirational quote. But I think when it comes to the Beatitudes, there is a promise at the end of each of them about something that will happen in the future. And so in a sense, Jesus is claiming to be uniquely placed to know with certainty what is going to happen in the future. And I think the question comes to anybody who reads the Beatitudes, do I trust that Jesus is qualified to make these promises? You know, so then that comes to a bigger question of who we think Jesus is to be making these kinds of promises in the first place. But then, yeah, much of the Sermon on the Mount is action. If we make a sort of rather simplistic dichotomy between action and contemplation, and I wouldn't want to hold that dichotomy all the way to the end, but it seems to me that the chapter 5 of the Gospel of Matthew contains a lot of insights about action and moral prohibitions, lies, murder, adultery, those kinds of things. But then in chapter 6, we move on to specifically religious practices, which precisely shows how Matthew 5 isn't necessarily about specifically religious practices. It's about just living a morally upright life. Chapter 6 is more about prayer and almsgiving and operating within a particular religious community and how you go about doing that. But yeah, chapter 5 contains just a very severe and intense and strict set of moral instructions for how to live, and that I would call action.
Thank you. I want to reference a specific passage from the writings of Swami Prabhavananda, which I think will help to illustrate the question that I have. So maybe just a bit of like a slight bit of background on that text. So the Sermon on the Mount, according to Vedanta, written by Swami Prabhavananda, is obviously, we could call it a commentary. Here we have a Hindu, whether or not Swami Prabhavananda would have called himself a Hindu theologian, I'm doubtful of that, just because the word theologian is not often brought into Hindu circles. But you know, he was a monk in the Ramakrishna order, Indian, moved to California, and was very influential in terms of bringing Vedantic teachings, so Advaita Vedanta being a strand of Hinduism, bringing Vedantic teachings into California, the US, North America more broadly. But he goes on to talk about knowing God. And because I shared the Beatitude which stuck out to me the most, which is that the pure in the heart will see God, it's maybe no surprise that I'm also zoning in here on this idea of knowing God, finding God, wanting God, etc. So I'm looking at page 20 of his text, but I'll just read it for us. He speaks about how we can have even a slight desire to know divine reality or God, that even if we only have a little bit of a desire, that small amount of self-effort can actually be enough to propel us forward, right? We need to start with a very small amount. But then he tells a story of a disciple who wanted to know God, who wanted to understand or to see God. And this disciple asked his teacher, "Sir, how can I realize God?" "Come along," said the teacher, "I will show you." He took the disciple to a lake and both plunged in. Suddenly the teacher reached over and pressed the disciple's head underwater. A few moments later, he released him and asked, "Well, how did you feel?" "Oh, I was dying for a breath of air," gasped the disciple. Then the teacher said, "When you feel that intensely for God, you won't have to wait long for his vision." Okay, so what we get from that passage is obviously, if you have this intensity desire to know God, you might then soon encounter him. But the idea behind that being, it's so hard for human beings to actually get to that point of having any desire for God at all. I'm realizing that we've not really spoken that much about the final chapters in the Sermon on the Mount. So I wonder if we could turn our attention there. Chapter 6, chapter 7 in Matthew. So again, kind of bringing it back to the course material, which is on contemplation and which is on well-being. When I look at these chapters, I do see a lot of content that actually to me feels quite related to well-being, or to mental well-being in particular, mental health, etc. So the first verse being, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they are? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life?" So this is a passage that I often see referred to in discussions about anxiety, about being present. I wonder if you could bring us through some of these passages, kind of giving your own theological interpretation to them.
Yeah, and a personal interpretation. I guess I would just say this is the one passage from the whole Sermon on the Mount that I find the very hardest to obey, live by, follow in any way. I find myself worrying a lot because I'm an academic, I'm an early career academic, and we have incredible job insecurity, and we constantly find ourselves worrying about where we're going to be employed in a year or 2 years' time, or whether we're going to have any employment. And also, having just become a father a year ago, that opens up a whole new world full of worries about whether my baby daughter is going to hurt herself any moment if she falls off something or stabs her eye out, or what she's going to be like when she's 15 or 20, whether she's going to marry somebody and be happy or unhappy or whatever. There's just these whole world of anxieties that sort of well up. So it's a very, very hard passage to follow. Yeah. And I think Jesus knew that when he said it. It wasn't any easier back then. In fact, it was probably a fair bit harder back in the first century not to worry about where your food was going to come from.
Right, because we do have many more like social options now than might have existed then. I was struck because you used the word obey. You said you find it hard to obey this passage. Is this passage meant to be obeyed? Like, are these rules that have to be followed? Or maybe you can just explain a little more what you meant when you said that you find it difficult to obey.
I mean, the Greek there is using the imperative just as it's using the imperative all the way through the Sermon on the Mount. So it's saying, do not worry, do not be anxious. The translation that I have in front of me says, do not be anxious. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's intended as a sort of authoritarian command any more than any of the other places where Jesus uses the imperative. I mean, we could certainly interpret it, at least at the base level, as saying, you do not need to worry.
Okay.
But then, sure, but worrying isn't a pleasant thing. Your life is better if you don't worry. That's what Jesus is trying to get at. So if he's guiding us into a way of being human, which is the best possible for our own flourishing and well-being, and what he's saying is, if you want that, if you want to flourish, if you want your own well-being to be the best possible, it will involve not worrying. And I find that challenging. I do think that that's a command to be obeyed, even if it's a command that's for my own benefit at the end of the day.
Right. Yeah, and it is, of course, extremely challenging, in part because these are kind of things we're telling our brain, like, no, you shouldn't do this. But anxiety and many other emotions actually happen beyond just the brain. They happen throughout the body. They're
absolutely
a response. So you can't simply tell yourself, don't worry. Don't be anxious. Don't do that. Well, there's more going on than the brain making a decision to do or to not do a certain,
Absolutely.
to have or to
You'd
not
go
have a
crazy.
certain emotion, right?
You'd go crazy if you just kept telling yourself, I mustn't worry,
Yeah,
because that's
it would
not
be
how the human
completely,
condition works.
yeah, it would be completely nonsensical and counterproductive. And yeah, but here we're having then an invitation or a reminder. Is that an okay way to put it? A
Yeah,
reminder that one way of being in the world is to not spend time in this anxious thought pattern of how am I going to be tomorrow? How am I going to be spending my time tomorrow? Will it be sufficient? Will it be, will I be satisfied tomorrow? Um,
yeah. I should say that this passage should not be interpreted as meaning that you shouldn't be responsible or plan for the future or take necessary precautions. And some Christians have interpreted it that way in the past. I think that's a rather foolish interpretation. But I think what Jesus is getting at, because he says, who of you by worrying can add a single hour to your life? What he's getting at is the fruitless anxiety that doesn't lead to any further action.
right.
Whereas obviously planning, when I'm trying to make sure my daughter is safe, I take precautions to stop her from hurting herself and from getting hurt, obviously. But then once I've taken the necessary precautions or the sufficient precautions, I then have to recognize that there is a limit to what I am capable of doing in my own power. And beyond that limit, I am powerless, I am helpless, and my daughter still could get hurt regardless of everything that I've done to try and prevent that. And that's where the command not to worry kicks in. It's at the limit of what we are capable of doing and how we think about what lies beyond that limit.
I think that's such a good way to put it. I think we have these very similar teachings coming from different religious and philosophical traditions. I think we have them flooding our social circles now, like now being the last 5 years, I'd say there's been an increase of awareness about how to be well, right? The things that we can do and the things that simply we have no control of, right? And how part of being well is realizing, like you say, I've reached the limit of what I can do to evoke change in this situation. So because I've done everything I can, if I were to continue, spending my energy in this anxious circle when I can't even do anything more about the situation, like that's a thing that's really not encouraged.
Yeah.
And this would not have been known, at least not with quantifiable evidence. This would not have been known in the time period this was written. But it's not only that, this question, can any one of you by worrying add a single hour to your life? We actually know now that worrying affects our immune system and other kind of bodily responses so much that we will actually detract hours from our lives, right? We will die sooner. And that's the hard truth, but we will die sooner if we are spending our energy in anxiety. Not not to kind of feel guilt or anxiousness about that very fact, right? But it's something that I think
that leads to a negative spiral, that's for sure.
Yeah, negative spirals could certainly happen with that knowledge. But I think it's this awareness of, okay, again, like I really like the way you said it, Barney, is, I have done everything within my power to plan well, to to create a safety, for my child or for my career or for my friendships or whatever it might be, right? I've done everything in my power, and now it's beyond me, right? So at that point, I stop the worry cycle as much as I'm capable of, right? And these are challenging things to actually do. Like you say, it might be the most challenging call of life.
Yeah.
And worry.
There are things that we can do to make us more capable. As you were saying, like just telling yourself not to worry doesn't achieve anything. But I think this is where the whole practice of contemplation really shows itself to have so much benefit. And here I mean contemplation in the richer sense than just the dictionary definition, like the religious sense of prolonged meditation in calm and in quiet on the beauty and goodness of the transcendent God in such a way that transforms your inner life into a life that is more focused around peace. And this you do find in all the different religious traditions, this practice of focusing your mind for long periods on the otherworldly realm so as to make this worldly concerns seem smaller by comparison.
Yeah, and I would add that we see that deeper, richer sense outside of religious traditions as well. They just happen to be worldviews which do not believe in a God, but who still believe in beauty, in something, the way that you described kind of the richer contemplation was focusing one's attention meditatively on the beauty of God, right? Or
yes,
the X attribute of God, the love of God, the beauty of God, the peace of God, etc. I think there are also ways to do that which don't rely on there being a God, so to speak. We
could just call them meditative practices more generally, or meditative traditions.
Yeah, whether that's being outside in nature and seeing a beautiful large tree and going, oh my goodness, like the strength that has come from this small seed to this great oak tree, right? Like what a way to be strong and to be stable in the world, right? There are ways to contemplate beauty, peace, love, strength, etc., that have nothing to do with God.
Yeah, and it's increasingly important and relevant in today's world where the news gives you so many things to be anxious about, not to mention the whole sort of atmosphere of daily life, at least in the Western world that I know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I really like the way that we're speaking through these passages. I find it really interesting to hear, Barney, to hear your perspectives, both as a Christian reading it, as a person reflecting on the text. Like it's all been really interesting. It of course would have been all the more interesting had we been somehow able to have Swami Prabhavananda, or even anyone within the Ramakrishna tradition, to comment on the Vedanta interpretation of these texts. I think that there's a lot of room there. There's a lot of room to play with. When we have this text and we interpret it from a Christian worldview versus interpreting it from a worldview where Christ is not the central hinge point of one's worldview, right? Where one looks to the teachings of Christ for inspiration, for guidance, for beauty, for wisdom, but it's perhaps a little more selective in the way that they interpret. I think that there's such a rich conversation to be had here, and obviously we're limited for time in what we can do, but I think there's such a rich conversation to be had in terms of how do we interpret texts based on our worldview, right? And how much our worldview will inform how we interpret the text, but also like how much are we willing to allow a text to weigh in and maybe even alter certain parts of our worldview, right? I think there's a lot to be had there. So thank you so much for going through this text with me. I found it really interesting.
Well, thank you. It's been very interesting for me too.
I'm glad to know that. I wanted to end with a question that I actually posed to our students on the very first day of the class that I have with them, which is trying to get at the relationship between contemplation and well-being. So again, the title of the course that I'm teaching is An Introduction to Contemplative Well-Being. And I think there's a bit of an assumption there that contemplative well-being, is an item. And I like to at least consider picking that apart and to pause and think about, well, what actually is the relationship between contemplation, which we can define very basically as prolonged reflective thought on something, or which we could take a slightly more philosophically or spiritually enriched interpretation and say prolonged thought that is, reflective on the attributes of the transcendent. And then well-being, which is often defined as being comfortable, being even happy. It's a word that is often associated with well-being. In your opinion, what is the relationship between contemplation and well-being?
I mean, my my immediate way of thinking about it is simply that well-being is the goal and contemplation is an essential element that you need in order to have well-being. I wouldn't say it's the only essential element, but I would certainly say that a life without contemplation is a life in which well-being will not be easy or perhaps not even possible. Now, so then I would say that perhaps contemplation, what does it do for well-being? Well, I came across this phrase once, which has stuck with me ever since, phrase, the narcotic of everyday life. And what that phrase opens up is this idea that the busyness and the chaos and the distractions of daily life, as we encounter it, have this effect of blurring our vision to the things of deeper importance, of more transcendental value, to the point where we would almost say that the busy world we live in is less real than the transcendental world, and we can get caught up in that unreality to the point where we lose sight of the deeper realities that actually move our being and bring about our flourishing. And contemplation, the goal of contemplation is simply to bring us back to reflect on the things in life which really matter, and to draw our minds away from the many distractions that constantly try to seize our attention on the here and now and on the physical realities that we see around us.
Thank you so much. I find that not only a fascinating answer, but something that does ring very true for the way I think about that relationship as well. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you very much.
Great.